On April 19, 1775, a shot was fired at Lexington, Massachusetts. It's known as the shot that was heard around the world. The bullet became the seed that would bloom into a new country called the United States of America. I'm Dr. Richard Gardiner from Columbus State University, and this is a Muscogee County School District podcast, The American Revolution. Before 1776, there was no United States of America. The colonies in America were part of England, but the King of England made the American colonists pay special taxes to refill the treasury that had been emptied as a result of the war against the French in America. When the Americans got all rowdy because they didn't like these taxes, the king became more strict. The colonists began to prepare for a fight. At that point in Virginia, a leader by the name of Patrick Henry stood up in a meeting and said, "Give me liberty or give me death." The Americans were preparing for a war. They started to gather their weapons at Concord, Massachusetts. On the night of April 18, 1775, the king's soldiers began to march toward Concord, Massachusetts, in order to take the Americans' guns away from them. But thanks to men like Robert Newman, who hung lanterns up in the Old North Church, and to men like Paul Revere, who saw the lanterns and went out and warned all of the Americans across the countryside that the king's men were making their move, the Americans would be ready for a fight in the morning on the road to Concord. In order to get from Boston to Concord, the king's troops had to march through the town of Lexington, Massachusetts. It was there that the shot that was heard around the world was fired, as the American Minutemen stepped out on Lexington Green and tried to stop the king's troops from going any farther. Though the American Minutemen were unsuccessful at stopping the king's troops on Lexington Green, once the troops pressed on to Concord, when they arrived at the Concord Bridge, the Americans put up a fight that the Redcoats found astonishing. The king's troops were forced to retreat from Concord back to Boston. But this retreat was devastating for the king's men. The Minutemen hid behind the walls and up in trees, and they fired on the Redcoats as they tried to escape back to Boston. Any way we look at it, the battles at Lexington and Concord were a victory for the American revolutionaries. But this was just the beginning of the war. The king's troops had retreated to their headquarters in downtown Boston. But it wouldn't be long before the Americans themselves came toward Boston to attack the king's men right there. The Americans perched themselves here on a hill that is known as Bunker Hill. When the British soldiers saw the Americans up on Bunker Hill, they realized they would have to attack them to get rid of the threat. When the king's soldiers began to march their way up this hill that we know as Bunker Hill, even though it was really Breed's Hill, the Americans began to fire on them, and they lost a lot of men coming up that hill. Although the British eventually accomplished their goal of running the Americans off the hill, they lost a lot of men in the process. When the British General Clinton was told that the Battle of Bunker Hill was a great victory for the British, he said, "Another victory like that, and we will be ruined." During the Battle of Bunker Hill, the Americans also lost their leading commander, General Joseph Warren. But because of their victories at Lexington and Concord, and their success at Bunker Hill, as well as the fact that they took a British fort called Ticonderoga out in New York, the beginning of the war looked very good for the Americans. That same summer, the leaders in all of the colonies again came together, and again they gathered in Philadelphia. This time, they met here at the Pennsylvania State House, but this building is better known now as Independence Hall, And the name of their gathering this time was called the Second Continental Congress. Although they were not yet ready to start a new nation altogether, most of the members of the Congress were supportive of the Americans fighting in Boston. One of the early decisions they made was to appoint an official leader, a general, for the American or the Continental Army. A brilliant man from Massachusetts named John Adams had an idea. Up to this point, the fighting in the war was limited to New England, here. But the people who lived in Virginia and other southern colonies here were not as strong in support of the Continentals. So how could the Second Continental Congress get the Southerners more excited about this war? John Adams' answer? Let's appoint a man from Virginia to lead the Continental Army. Adams made the suggestion that Colonel George Washington from Virginia be made the official commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. The Congress agreed, and it was perhaps the most important decision in American history. George Washington took command of the Continental troops on the hills south of Boston known as Dorchester Heights. This was a good position for the Americans to siege the city, but sadly for General Washington, they did not have any cannons. They had access to the cannons at Fort Ticonderoga in New York, which they took from the British earlier in the year. The problem was that there was no way to get the cannons to Boston, because between Ticonderoga and Boston, there were large Appalachian mountains, which by November were covered entirely with snow. A Boston bookseller named Henry Knox came to George Washington and said he believed he could get the cannons over the mountains. Although it would take a miracle, George Washington gave Knox permission to try. Using oxen, sleds, and prayers, Knox successfully delivered the cannons from Ticonderoga to General Washington on January 24th. George Washington was delighted. What Washington did next was typical of his strategy throughout this war. Though he was without a sufficient number of cannonballs, he would proceed to fake out the British in Boston simply by placing the cannon on the heights to scare the redcoats into leaving Boston. The plan worked. The redcoat soldiers fled Boston on March 17, leaving in ships all the way to Nova Scotia. One of the first coins ever made by the United States of America was in honor of this event. This coin has an engraving of Washington and Knox on Dorchester Heights with the cannons aimed at Boston. The words at the top of this coin are Hostibus Primo Fugatis, Latin words that mean, where we first made the enemy flee. During this same time, a man by the name of Thomas Paine published a book that was read by nearly everyone. The name of the book was Common Sense. The reason Paine wrote Common Sense was to convince the Americans that they could declare themselves independent of England and start their own country. Meanwhile, on May 15 in Philadelphia, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia introduced a suggestion to the Second Continental Congress that was very bold. Lee suggested that the Congress vote that these colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, absolved from the allegiance to the British Crown. Lee was suggesting that the Americans declare their independence, that they form a new nation of their own. The Congress took some time to think about it before they would vote, almost 2 months. During that time, they appointed a committee to write a Declaration of Independence. Among the committee members were John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and Thomas Jefferson. Though John Adams was the most qualified to write the Declaration, Adams declined the job and instead gave it to the Virginian, Thomas Jefferson. This was for the same reason he suggested George Washington to lead the army. Adams wanted a Virginian at the head of everything in order to get more Southerners on the team. Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, and it was brought to the Congress for approval in July 1776. On July 2nd, John Hancock asked the members to vote to declare independence, and they did. On July 4th, 1776, the Declaration of Independence was adopted and signed by the chairman, John Hancock. The other members all signed soon thereafter. The Declaration of Independence was the birth certificate for the United States of America. A new nation was born. But the King of England wasn't going to let the Americans leave his empire that easily. The war would continue for many, many years.